The stories featured in this video are based on true experiences from subscribers of the Mr. Extreme's YouTube channel and the Dreamercast Paranormal Podcast. If you or someone you know has a fascinating true paranormal experience you'd like to share, check out mrextremes.com to submit your story. That's mrxdreams.com. Enjoy. A year ago, I met a very interesting man who eventually became a good friend to me. I'll call him Chris, to protect his identity. We both have a military background, so naturally we spoke about some of our exploits in those past lives. He had an unexpectedly haunting story to tell, and when I later got this channel up and running, I asked if I could share it with you. So here we go. This took place on an undisclosed military base located in the damp jungles of a remote island. Chris says he remembers the wilderness being unnervingly quiet for at least a week leading up to the incident. The personnel stationed there chalked the silence up to a change in seasons or something. There had been reports of bizarre sightings, fast-moving animals no one could explain. Anyone who mentioned them was typically shut down with ridicule from fellow soldiers. The sightings were notably inconsistent with one another. Some saw large eyes, others saw small ones. Some heard a big thing trudging boisterously through the woods. Others heard the sounds of something small and light sneaking around in the bush. No one had seen anything worth defending in an inevitable argument, let alone losing their reputation over. Chris heard every report due to the fact that he was the desk sergeant at the time. Anyone who saw or heard something off, which could potentially impact the security of the base, would typically come to him to have it notated in the log. He never took the more fantastical reports seriously enough to actually write them down, unbeknownst to the concerned soldiers who came to him. Some of them came just to talk about what happened, off the record anyway, which would typically end with them just trading ghost stories. On the night in question, Chris and his team were on the far side of the island, an area which was completely uninhabited, where no human presence could be found for hundreds of miles in every direction. For that reason, the military chose that location for storing their weapons and explosives. Chris and a partner, who I'll call Barry, were conducting the nightly checks on the magazine storage areas, which lay several miles deep into the uninhabited zone. The jungle was still weirdly quiet, but it was good for them, being that their mission was to detect foreign intelligence or operatives tampering with U.S. equipment, or the occasional refugee group that was washing ashore. They were on a road that rested in the valley of two mountains, bordered by gigantic hills, thick and rocky with tall grass. As they drove along slowly with their Humvee windows down, they heard a heavy thud coming from the woods. A totally unexpected, unnatural sound emanated clearly from the tangled growth. The first thud drew attention, but was quickly followed by other noises. Barry shut off the headlights and shut off the engine so they could sneak up on whatever was out there. They knew anyone attempting to navigate the dense vegetation would have to do so carefully, taking time to avoid injury. But surprisingly, they could hear fast-paced walking, rustling through the tall grass. After a few moments, the sound began to move parallel to the road. They restarted the vehicle and started to pursue the noise. The walking continued for a while as they followed it with only their running lights before suddenly stopping. They at first thought they'd lost track of whatever it was, so they turned the headlights back on, assuming it was a deer or something, and continued a distance down the road. As Barry proceeded to turn the high beams on, both men noticed something in the distance, approximately 30 yards ahead. A humanoid creature jumping into the road and then into the brush on the other side. It was gray, over 2 meters tall with a small oval head. Its movements were too swift for its size. The best way he could describe its leaping motion was like that of an impossibly nimble frog. Seeing the creature instantly gave Chris the feeling of being punched in the stomach, His heart sank so rapidly and adrenaline kicked in so fast that he began to feel nauseous, on the verge of vomiting. He laments the fact that neither of them had the will to chase after the creature, but that the feeling of being at such a disadvantage was absolutely petrifying. The idea that they were stalking it raised the question, were they hunting or being hunted themselves? Whatever it was, the monster definitely had the tactical advantage of position and mobility. Chris and Barry turned their truck around and sped off into the night. The woods remained silent for at least another week, returning to the normal droning sounds of the local wildlife. This came from a conversation I had, which quickly turned into a live interview with a friend of mine who lived in the neighborhood until very recently. His name was Gabriel, so today I thought I would try telling you the story rather than reading it from the perspective of the person who lived it. One evening, he and I were talking when the topic of discussion meandered into the territory of the strange, a thing that is quite common when I talk to people. As the keywords began to pop up, ghosts, vampires, dogmen, glitches, etc., I noticed a peculiar spark of familiarity, a passion in his eyes that told me without a doubt he himself had seen something in his time. Gabriel was a native of Costa Rica. He grew up most of his life there before immigrating to the United States. When I asked him if he had ever seen anything odd, his eyes widened. Yes, I did, he said, half excited, half under his breath. Have you ever heard of Cadejo? I had not. As he spoke, I ran an image search of the Spanish word. Gabriel's eyes shifted, almost looking past me as he recounted the story of a dark night in San Jose, Costa Rica, when he was only 10 years old. He lived with his mother and father and older brother in a small suburb called Las Animas, meaning City of Lost Souls. The family home was a brand new construction on a street with only 2 houses that were separated by several empty lots. Gabriel's father was a metal worker, so he made sure his home was fortified with steel doors, door frames, and window bars to withstand the high crime rate of the small town. The small backyard was walled in to make it less attractive to robbers, and they had a Doberman guard dog named Rambo to keep watch when the family was out and about. The dog had to be trained to only accept food from Gabriel's father, because thieves in the area were known to try and feed poison to guard dogs in order to gain access to homes. In that neighborhood, there were typically an unspoken curfew for children after dark. If they were away from home and not with their parents or didn't have a ride home, they were basically to stay the night wherever they were, just to be safe. So, one night, Gabriel and his brother Miguel were over at their friend Carlos's house, who happened to live in the only other house on their street. They ended up staying until just after nightfall, but they really wanted to go home anyway. The 2 brothers debated with Carlos and his mother about walking home. Although both houses were extremely well lit with floodlights, there was about 75 yards of unlit dirt road and knee-high grass between them. Now, they had made the trek into darkness before, but always with their mother waiting outside, keeping an eye on them. This time she was nowhere to be seen, making the boys feel a bit more apprehensive. As their debate continues, their mother finally stepped out and began to wave at them to come home. When they saw her, the boys started on their way in a jog, turning back to say goodnight to Carlos and his mother as they went back inside. And this is where things get weird. When the boys turned back to look at their mother, she was gone. What they saw instead, standing across the street in the middle of a field, a ways up the road, was a dog. The boys slowed to a deliberate walk as their old tennis shoes scraped along the unpaved, overgrown road. They stared at the dark figure in the distance, trying to decipher it. They could tell it was a dog, no surprise. They had 2, but it looked far too large and imposing to be of their Dobermans. They noticed the glimmer of a thick chain wrapped around the dog's neck. The eerie sound of the metal rattling permeated the night air. For a moment, they told themselves it was just Rambo, that maybe he broke free of his chain and got out. The brothers argued over whether or not it was Rambo as they walked steadily toward the house. The closer they got to where the mysterious dog was, the more they noticed that it seemed to be growing in size. When they finally realized that what they were looking at was not their beloved Rambo, the two young boys halted in their tracks. Gabriel looked up at Miguel. Now, as we sat in my studio, Gabriel's eyes began to well with tears. He said that despite all the trouble they'd gotten into, it was the first time he'd ever seen his big brother scared. They didn't know it at the time, but what they were seeing, the thing that was watching them, was a conejo. What you and I know as a kind of hellhound. The black dog shifted its ominous gaze between the boys and their house, looking back and forth over and over as if acknowledging that at any moment they were going to have to make a run for it. It stood as an imposing wall between them and safe haven. The boys knew that they were too far to make it back to Carlos's house without being caught, but continuing down the road felt like certain death. The best chance was to walk back the way they came. They slowly turned and started back, when they heard the front door open. Their mother emerged from the doorway with her hand shielding her eyes from the floodlights. Throwing the fears into the wind, the brothers made the only decision they could. They broke into a sprint, running harder than they ever had before to save their mother. The hound's head shot toward her and it catapulted its massive body into the air, leaping at least 30 feet in one terrifying motion before violently slamming into the ground and beginning its own mad dash toward the house. The beast cut a wide path through the tall weeds of the field. The loud metallic sound of the chains intensified as it closed in. Somehow, the boys were able to get to their mother before the hound, grab hold of her and pull her inside. They slammed the doors behind him and retreated inside. Their mother prayed in a state of disbelief as the front door trembled with blow after blow from the enraged monster outside. After only a few moments of excruciating terror, the noise suddenly stopped, replaced by a loud car horn blaring from outside the garage. Gabriel's father yelled at them to activate the metal-clad garage door from inside the house. Miguel hit the switch, opening the garage door, and was promptly scolded by his father for letting the dog outside. Gabriel and Miguel opened the front door and looked around, finding no signs of the conejo. As they continued to investigate, they found poor Rambo cowering in fear, hiding in a small crawl space under the stoop of their porch. As I wrapped my head around this intriguing story, jotting down notes on my computer as quickly as I could, Gabriel's face lit up at my clear fascination with his experience. He told me, "You know what?" He used my real name. "I have another story for you. Have you ever heard of La Llorona?" I told him I did, but that's a story for another time. My name is Lou. First off, I love your channel. It's so great that people have a place to share their stories. It's this community and the environment you created that has emboldened me to actually share my own life-altering experience with the unknown. I normally don't like to talk about it for fear of what people would think, but if there is any place I'd find some level of compassion and understanding, it must be here with you and the people who listen. Several years ago, I was on my way home from work in the financial district of Lower Manhattan. I worked in an office building literally a block away from Wall Street. This was late 2011, around the time of those Occupy Wall Street protests in Zuccotti Park. The streets were packed with people wearing backpacks and headphones, carrying signs and megaphones. It was pretty much impossible not to bump into people as you tried to navigate the narrow sidewalks. The hassle wasn't anything special to me. I had my earbuds in with music playing to drown out the noises during my commute, just like any other day. I do consider myself a New Yorker through and through, after all. However, in order to get to the subway and back home to Queens, I had to either go around or right through Zuccotti Park, which did get a bit annoying after a while. Still, crowded streets are a part of reality. Unfortunately, the same is true for the millions of homeless people taking refuge in the various nooks and crannies of the city. I'm not a saint or anything, but I do try to at least drop a bit of spare change in their cups every so often. I wish I could say it was every time, but it's not. I want to help when I can, but I'm embarrassed to say that I'm sometimes in such a rush that I don't even notice them there. I guess that makes me no different than the people who just breeze by the needy without giving the poor souls even a single glance. Sometimes it's as if the homeless are an invisible element in our cities, subsisting on the scraps left behind by those more well off. I think that may be the reason what happened that afternoon, right in the midst of crowds of people, was able to go unnoticed. I don't think anyone but me realized or even cared about what was happening. The park was too crowded for me to walk through. Instead of trying to fight my way across the subway, I had decided to circle around and try a different stop in a quieter area. To get there, I cut into a side street that was significantly less busy. The moment I set foot there, I was struck with a feeling of heaviness and dread that instantly plunged my previously decent mood into an abyss. I couldn't understand why or where it was coming from, so I pulled out my earbuds and turned my music off. I felt I needed my senses to be as sharp as possible for whatever danger I was sensing. As I tucked the earbuds away into my coat pocket, a pungent odor began to creep into my nose. It was the smell that hits you when you walk into a subway car that a homeless person has made their home. I looked ahead toward the corner of one of the buildings to see a surprisingly young man in torn-up jeans and a hoodie. He had wild black hair and a long, unkempt beard. He rocked back and forth with a look of utter hopelessness etched into his face. He clutched a small cardboard sign covered in writing. I picked out a section that read, "Help, please, Army vet. Lost everything. Just need $40 to get back home." There were very few people walking down that particular street, but there were enough passing through that he would occasionally pop out from his corner with his arms outstretched holding the sign, begging for acknowledgement. It was a sad sight to behold. I felt terrible knowing that I had nothing on me to spare, so I would inevitably end up being one of those people myself, walking by him without seeming to care at all. Just as that thought crossed my mind, I saw an odd-looking man further down the road walking toward the homeless guy. The strange man stopped and crouched down to the homeless one's level. After staring at him for a moment, the stranger reached into his pocket and pulled out a large roll of cash, holding it out in front of him as if to offer it, but clearly holding back. It was a bizarre sight, especially in New York City, but at least I no longer felt guilty for being unable to help the poor guy. I wish things went as you would expect from that point on, but unfortunately, that's where things began to get weird. To be honest, I've been building up this long preamble because every time I think back to this event, a sharp chill runs down my spine and I swear my eyes tear up. As I continued to walk toward the pair, I realized that everything, like the world around me, began to slow down somehow. The loud noises of city streets faded into a soup of auditory blur. Every sound muffled as if I was holding my hands over my ears or had my head underwater. As this was happening, I realized I was staring at the strange man holding the wad of cash. I noticed how ordinary he was. Everything about him was plain. He was dressed like any other white-collar worker. A simple, or even slightly ugly brown suit hung loosely on his slender frame. He wore a tie and dress shoes and carried a generic leather briefcase. He also had a matching brown hat on his head, angled to hide the top half of his face. Looking back, I wish that was all I had seen. As I slowly made my way closer to them, the stranger lifted his head to meet the confused gaze of the homeless man. That's when I stopped dead in my tracks. The formerly bland appearance of the man became clearer to me, and I noticed two haunting features. His skin was a bizarre ashen white, not paper white, but not quite gray either. His eyes, they were a deeper black than I could ever describe. I tried my best to rationalize what I was seeing. A guy wearing black contacts and a business suit would be a little weird, but I'm sure it wouldn't be the first time someone made those particular fashion choices out in New York City. I can tell you this, though. A regular guy dressed that way would not be enough to stop a New Yorker in their tracks like it did me. It was more than the look of him. It was the feeling I got from him. It was like being punched in the chest. As a child, I dealt with frequent asthma attacks, and as an adult, I've had more than my fair share of panic attacks. But this was something else entirely. Much worse. A heavy, nauseating feeling that was born in the pit of my stomach and crawled up my chest before nesting in my throat. The air had become solid around me as I stood there frozen. I could see in my peripheral vision that other people were still walking by through the side streets, although they moved in slow motion. After a few moments, the strange man and the homeless man's voices seemed to emerge from the muffled white noise of the rest of the city. Their voices slowly became clearer and clearer. I missed a lot of what was being said, but certain words stood out. "I don't want to die." The words stuttered from the homeless man's mouth as he reached for the money. His eyes were fixed on the roll of cash, yet steeped in hesitation and fear. The stranger smiled at him, and I swear to you, something about that smile made me want to scream. It was that moment I realized I couldn't scream even if I wanted to. I could do nothing but stand there helplessly, my feet nailed to the concrete sidewalk as the scene played out just a few yards in front of me. The stranger's response was chilling. "Oh, well, you're going to die either way, Robbie." Judging by the homeless man's reaction, that must have been his name. At the mention of his name, Robbie sat straight up with a look of slack-jawed amazement tinged with horror. Side note, going forward, I'll refer to the man in the brown suit as Brown. This will be important in a few moments. So before Robbie could say anything, Brown lifted his hands as if to give an important presentation and spoke again. His voice was just so wrong. I can only describe it as oily, gravelly and wet, like someone trying to talk through a mouthful of phlegm. If you think the description sounds gross, just imagine how foul it made me feel hearing it.
"Question is, do you want to die happy and comfortable, wanting nothing? Or here in this alley where no one will even notice until you've been rotting a while?"
I still don't know how that scream didn't fly out of my mouth after what happened next. If I could have moved at all, I might have jumped right out of my skin. A third voice chimed in before its corresponding figure stepped into my view. Another strange man, nearly identical to Brown except taller and somehow even thinner and wearing a gray suit. I'll call this one Gray for the sake of organization. Gray held a lit cigarette and stared down at Robbie with a tired ambivalence.
"Take the money, Robert. We have things to do."
Robbie nodded with a resigned expression as he took the cash. He gasped as he clawed at the bills, unfurling a surprising amount.
"This is so much,"
he exclaimed. I couldn't make out what was said next. I saw Brown stand up next to Gray, followed by Robbie standing and gathering his few possessions from the ground before thanking the two strange men and briskly walking toward me. He brushed past me in a hurry, thanking God over and over again, crying. I still couldn't move. I was stuck there as the two strangers' gaze fell onto me when Robbie was out of sight. The two sets of pitch-black eyes staring at me gave me the distinct feeling of being watched by something not human. Their mouths moved as if speaking to each other, but I couldn't make it out. The volume of the white noise around me was going crazy, up and down. It was disorienting. Eventually, I could hear a few bits of their conversation, but the language was unlike anything I've ever heard. Now think about this. I speak fluent Spanish and understand bits of many other languages, Italian, French, a little Japanese, Arabic, and even some Yiddish. You tend to pick up little things here and there living in New York. I can certainly place a language roughly when hearing it. What the strangers were speaking was unlike anything I'd ever encountered. The sounds they were making weren't even sounds that people made. It actually caused me physical pain in my ears when I really began to hear it, like when your ears pop on an airplane. The feeling when you know there's pressure there, but you can't get it out, so it stings. The pain got so bad I wanted to vomit. Brown snarled a word at his friend in the same wet voice.
English.
Gray made a bizarre clicking noise, smiling the same horrific smile Brown did earlier.
That far gone, huh? It'll be fine,
Brown responded.
Yeah? Then why'd you lie?
What Brown said next still keeps me up at nights, even all these years later. He rolled his shoulders back and grunted.
Doesn't matter. I'll be wearing that stupid chimp by the next moon.
And made clicking noises. My eyes began to well with tears as I tried desperately to look away. I was still paralyzed. Slowly, the world began to creak back toward normal speed again. I'm telling you, I'm trying so hard not to cry as I sit here typing this. Just like the plight of Robbie or any other homeless person, no one bothered to even look at me as I stood there in terror. People were there, moving slower than normal, at least from my perspective, but no one stopped or noticed I was in trouble. Gray looked directly at me. My head started swinging and I felt immediately dizzy. My vision blurred and I lost focus on all things except one thing, Gray's voice.
Well now, look what this one can do. Cute.
Suddenly, Brown stepped forward from the blur in my eyes. His black-eyed face sneered at me from mere inches away.
Whatever. A chimp's a chimp. They're all the same. Hey, you, chimp. Leave now.
He snarled again, and I felt it in my bones.
Keep walking.
I wish I could tell you what happened next, but the next thing I knew I was standing on the sidewalk all the way at Columbus Circle in Midtown, almost a half-hour's walk north of where I was. A man I didn't know was holding my shoulders as random people passed by with concerned looks on their faces. When things came back into focus, I could finally hear the man's voice.
Yo, you alright, son?
He asked with a trembling voice.
You almost walked into traffic, man. You okay? Must be on drugs,
someone yelled out as they scooted by. I told the man I was okay as tears began to run freely down my face. I apologized and fled the scene, rushing over to the escalator to the A train, having no idea how I got so far uptown. By the time I got home, I realized I wouldn't be able to tell anyone, not even my wife. She'd definitely think I was losing my mind. I haven't seen those strange men or whatever they were since that day. I thank God for that. Over the years, I've done research into the paranormal to try to identify what they may have been, but I haven't found anything with their description of actions. Now, I've heard of black-eyed kids, and the vibes people seem to get from them are similar to how I've felt with Brown and Gray, but the situation overall was different. These were grown, at least middle-aged males, I think. I don't know what I saw. It still messes with me. I've been to therapy about this and have tried rationalizing, but no luck. Whatever the case, I can say that nowadays I can go about my daily life without thinking about that incident. Whenever I allow myself to reflect back on it, it shakes me up. And I'm not immune to late nights of insomnia for fear of nightmares. I still question my own sanity every so often. Was this even real? In my research and experience, I find cinnamon seems to work to ward off mimics. It worked for the family of a friend of mine. That's the reason I write to you today. I'll explain. This happened when I was a little girl in the early 90s, maybe around 1993. I had a friend named Sandy. Sandy was an only child until the birth of her sister, Faye. One summer when Sandy was about 7 years old, her parents decided to take a cross-country road trip to Disney World in Florida. The family had a great time at the park, but as many of us know, the days went by in a blur. I guess the human mind can only take but so much childlike wonder and amazement before the memories start to run together. Before she knew it, Sandy and her family were packing up the minivan to head back home. This is where things got weird. As they finally made it home and unpacked their things, there was something wrong. Sandy noticed that somehow there was no longer just one Faye, but two. She didn't trust either of them, getting a strange feeling that each of the 2-year-old girls were aware of some hidden deception. Shortly after the return, Sandy's parents began going out and purchasing duplicate furniture pieces to accommodate the new addition to the family. I remember talking to her and us both being confused about the whole thing, even with our young, normally carefree minds. For quite a while, her parents simply referred to both girls as Faye, but eventually they took to calling one of them Kay. Here's where the cinnamon came in. Sandy's mother used to make her favorite cookies, snickerdoodles. After Kay showed up, Sandy complained that her mom never made them anymore. Cinnamon is a key ingredient. In fact, any traces of cinnamon basically vanish from the house before we notice. One time when Kay was about 4 years old, the four of us were at a mutual friend's house eating cereal. Kay tried a piece of our friend's cereal that was flavored with cinnamon sugar. She quickly spat it out, saying that it was icky. However, as she recoiled and grimaced, I noticed that she began to undergo some extremely disturbing changes. Her tongue and lips blackened, and the texture seemed to briefly shift in texture to something less than human. It was as if her skin had become charred and burned, with the blackness spreading across her lower jaw and up to her nose before retracting back to normal with frightening speed. The only reason I noticed it was because I was so distrustful of her. I usually found myself staring at her with a constant sense of suspicion. Faye, the original one, I think, had been eating the cereal by the handful. Kay started crying and knocked the cereal out of her sister's grasp, making her wash her hands before dragging her back to their house down the street. Sandy's mother forbade her children from visiting the house after that based on something Kay told her, and we never found out what. The weirdest part of all this is that Sandy's parents never acknowledged the weirdness of all this. The mysterious appearance of an extra child in their home. The clear lack of preparation that made them have to go out and buy duplicates of everything, and so many other effects. Kay had the ability to make her presence seem so unextraordinary. Eventually, I lost touch with Sandy and her strange family after a series of bitter fights and arguments between her and I. We basically ripped each other to shreds emotionally, and I didn't see them again until the late 90s when my brother died. For some reason, Kay had clearly developed an intense hatred of me. I found that out over the years. Faye had been constantly sick with flus and other maladies. No one knew exactly why. Sandy finally moved away when her parents divorced. Please share this story because I would hate for anyone to end up like Sandy's parents, having one of their children truly mimicked with no knowledge of which is the original one. What's even worse is that a mimic can tie its life force with its victim, and in that case, they really will have an extra child, one that's secretly a demonic parasite with an extreme allergy to cinnamon. My name is Tom. I wanted to share a story with you I've kept to myself for many years. And all this time, it's been both a haunting memory and, in some ways, oddly a pleasant one. I live in Alabama, but my family roots run deeply in Ireland. My grandparents have been telling me stories about the Fae of Celtic legend since I was 5 years old. Leprechauns, changelings, fairies, and the subject of this story, the Banshee. I've always took my grandparents at their word, assuming the legends to be true, up until my teenage years when I began to grow up, or so I thought. As I'm sure you've guessed by now, there came a time when I was forced to see that I was wrong. The night before my high school graduation, my grandfather passed away due to a heart attack, and I had to open my eyes to the legends once again. That very night, I became a true believer. Needless to say, I didn't make it to my graduation ceremony, opting to stay with my grandmother and keep her company. She was understandably broken up. At about 2 in the morning, 5 hours after my grandfather passed, I decided to sneak out to the front porch of my grandmother's rural home for a quick cigarette while everyone else was sound asleep. The night was cold and dimly lit by a full moon. After my first drag from the cigarette, the gravity of the situation hit me and I lost it. Tears streamed down my face as I contemplated life without the man I grew up loving. All the memories came flooding in like a tidal wave crashing at the shores of my mind. It took me a while to cool down, but eventually I was able to collect myself. Just as the feeling of flushed-out emotional energy started to wash over me, I heard the most bone-chilling scream I've ever heard in my life. My head darted frantically, straining to find something to pick out in the low light. My eyes caught on a splotch of paleness not far away from the house. It was a long, flowing white dress. As I scanned upward, analyzing the unexpected figure, I could see strands of long black hair dancing in the wind, obscuring the mysterious face of a woman. One word came to the forefront of my mind as I desperately searched for an explanation. Banshee. As I stared on, I noticed another figure standing next to the woman. After focusing my eyes on it, I could clearly see that it was my grandfather. He was right there, just meters away from me. 5 hours after he was taken away by the ambulance to have his final wishes carried out. He gazed longingly toward the house, while the woman stared away into the distance. I watched them, petrified for what seemed like an eternity before the banshee suddenly turned her head to lock eyes with me. My heart seemed to stop as the details of her legend came back to me. The banshee was said to be something like an angel of death, appearing to signify the death of someone. Some say she appears to take lives. A few seconds later, she unleashed another unearthly scream as my grandfather raised his hand to bid me farewell one last time. The two vanished before my eyes, leaving me alone in the darkness. After that night, the way I saw things was forever altered. I realized that the world we think we know is far too strange to make many hard claims. This event began what I strongly feel will be a trend in my life. I have this inkling that my future holds many more bizarre encounters. I've had a few more already. I'm a 24-year-old male living in the Philippines. The story I wanted to share with you isn't exactly my own, but was told to me by my father some years ago. The events transpired when I was only a year old. Back then, my family lived in a pretty rural area where everyone knew everyone. We also had a ton of relatives nearby living in the same group of neighborhoods. One day, my dad was outside in the backyard watering plants. He was minding his own business when he suddenly noticed an unusually large black bird perched in an old tree. The branches of that tree hung low, so my dad got a much better look at the bird than I'm sure he wanted to. He didn't think anything of it at first, but he soon noticed that the bird's eyes were a deep red. Not glowing or anything like that, but more like they were severely bloodshot. He said the bird sat there, staring at him, returning my father's ponderous gaze just as intently as he watched it. Dad was unsettled, but soon got back to his work, got done watering, and went outside. A few hours later, it was night. Dad went back outside to do some more chores in the yard. Now, the way our houses were set up, there was sort of an alleyway with a fence that separated our house from the one next door. My dad was finishing up when he caught a glimpse of something small scurrying across the alleyway, making a splash in a puddle of water. Since we had a pet turtle at the time, a red-eared slider, Dad thought that maybe the turtle got out of his tank somehow and was trying to run off. He walked over to the dark alley and, upon closer inspection, found the culprit. Oddly, what he found there was a large crab of some kind. This wasn't a common sight in my area. The crab the size of a dinner plate. The strangest part was that, in the low light coming from the back of our house, my dad could see the crab's eyes. They were the same deep blood-red color of the blackbirds he'd seen earlier. The crab stopped in his tracks and stared him down, that same intense glare from his encounter with the large bird. He quickly dropped what he was doing and went back inside the house, admittedly creeped out by yet another bizarre animal sighting. The next day, Dad went to speak to the neighborhood elders about what he'd seen. They told him it was an aswang. So if you didn't know, stories of aswang are all over the Philippines, especially out in rural areas. They're basically the Philippines' equivalent to vampires of Western folklore in terms of mythology. They're said to be shapeshifters who have a taste for human and animal entrails, but their most sought-after delicacy is the flesh of an unborn child. The legends have it that the aswang would crawl around on rooftops at night, searching for pregnant women. When it found one, it would settle above the expectant mother as she slept, winding its freakishly long, prehensile tongue into her room by some opening in the roof, and suck the baby out from her very womb. As it happened, my mother was pregnant with my little sister. One of the elders claimed he knew the aswang had paid a visit to our house. I don't know how he knew this information, but he insisted that this particular aswang wasn't trying to eat my sister. Rather, he said it simply liked being around pregnant women because it finds their aroma to be somehow intoxicating. My dad said although it was still creepy, he was a bit relieved that he wasn't dealing with a creature that wanted to harm his family. My sister was born without any problems, and we never heard from that creature again, as far as I know. When I was around 5 or 6 years old, my family lived in a small 2-story home near the outskirts of Omaha, Nebraska. Imagine if you were standing out in front facing the house, you would see that a lonely streetlight was off to the left, and my room was on the right side, kind of sitting in the house's shadow. Before I explain what I saw, I have to give you a quick side note. The kids at my school used to say that my eyes turned red when I got angry, so they gave me a very hurtful nickname. One day when I got home from school, I saw it written with markers on my bedroom window. Big, jagged letters scrawled out the word demon across the glass. I couldn't believe someone went to so much trouble just to do that to me. They used a ladder we kept around back of the house. It hadn't been moved in ages and was covered with weeds and dirt, so it left clear signs against the wall below my window. I got so mad that I hit the window with a rock and it shattered. My father had to cover it with a garbage bag and some duct tape. It was a summer night, close to midnight, when I got up to go to the bathroom. Despite it being so late, I was awake and full of energy, so I decided to sneak and play video games in my room. About an hour later, around 1 a.m., out of nowhere, I hear a faint scream coming from outside. I could tell it was a woman. Scared but still curious, I ran downstairs to look out the window in the living room, but I was shocked when I realized that the whole room was bathed in red light. As I surveyed the surreal environment, it felt like an alien world despite the fact that it was full of the furniture and items I saw and enjoyed every day. I looked up to see the windows were all covered, essentially plastered with some kind of paper-like material that seemed to be soaked in blood-red liquid. I ran back up to my room and carefully climbed up on the sill, peering through the unbroken part of the window so as not to be noticed. What I saw, just at the edge of the circle of light on the street, was the shape of a man crouching over a woman who lay motionless on the ground. The man wore an orange short-sleeved shirt and what looked like jeans, but the girl was dressed in a sort of business casual attire. a collared white shirt with a black skirt and stockings. I saw a streak of blue in her otherwise brown hair. The man looked up, and his face was so pale that it stood in contrast against the darkness around him. A dark red speared and stained his mouth and face, and that's when I realized I was looking at a vampire. As the shock and fear began to build in my mind, he turned his head directly toward me with a startled look. He glared at me before sweeping the girl up from the ground and dashing away with such incredible speed it didn't seem natural at all, even to my childlike mind. I went back downstairs after he left and saw that the windows were back to normal. The next day I went over to the spot where the attack had occurred and saw spots of blood on the pavement along with a silver necklace. I took the necklace and cleaned it up, and I still have it to this day. The crazy thing is, following the incident, I began to have nightmares of my hands being drenched in blood. Those soon evolved into dreams where everything in my house would be spattered with it. My bed, the floor, the ceiling, and the walls. It was like I was living in a slaughterhouse. A few days later, I woke up and had a bite mark on my arm. The mark was deep enough that it drew blood, so I showered and covered it up, doing my best to keep it hidden because I knew no one would believe me, and I already had a reputation for being a demon at school. On top of that, I knew my mother would have thought I was cutting myself, and I just didn't want the trouble. I guess I was pretty stupid back then. I don't know what I saw, and I know I was very young, but I truly believe the man was a vampire. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Be sure to subscribe and click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/letsreadofficial, and give and receive feedback from the community, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And join my Discord to interact with me and other listeners directly. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations for just $1 a month on Patreon, and maybe even pick up some Let's Read merch on Spreadshirt. Links in the bio. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, don't forget to wipe and stay off the pipe.